"Burn it," Richard Coleman said with a smile that never reached his eyes. The words floated across the marble lobby of First Dominion Bank and seemed to stop the room cold. For a second, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The soft clicking of keyboards faded. Even the distant hum of the air conditioning felt quieter. Then Richard reached into his pocket, pulled out a small silver lighter, and flicked it open. A tiny flame danced above his thumb. Across from him stood Marcus Reed, a tall black man in a faded brown jacket, worn blue jeans, and scuffed work boots. He held no briefcase. No designer watch gleamed on his wrist. No expensive suit announced importance before he spoke. To everyone watching, he looked like an ordinary man who had wandered into the wrong bank on the wrong day. Richard carefully placed the check into a metal tray normally used for paperwork and lowered the flame toward the corner. A few customers gasped. Others leaned forward. One young man near the coffee station quietly lifted his phone and started recording. The edge of the paper darkened. A thin curl of smoke rose into the bright morning light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Sir," Claire Bennett said from behind the customer service desk, her voice hesitant. "Maybe we should verify the account first." Richard never looked at her. "There's nothing to verify." The flame spread slowly across the corner of the check. People like this walk in every week with fake stories and fake documents. A few uncomfortable chuckles came from nearby customers. Claire shifted nervously in her chair. She had only worked at the branch for 3 months, but something about the situation felt wrong. Marcus wasn't arguing. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't demanding special treatment. If anything, he looked strangely calm. Richard glanced at Marcus. "You claimed this check was valid." He laughed softly. $50 million. More people turned their heads. $50 million. The number moved through the lobby like an electric current. A woman waiting for a loan appointment nearly dropped her folder. A security guard standing near the entrance narrowed his eyes. Richard shook his head. Dramatically. "You expect anyone here to believe that?" The flame reached the center of the paper. Smoke drifted upward beneath the crystal chandelier. Marcus simply watched. His dark eyes followed the burning edge without urgency, without anger, without fear. That unsettled Claire more than anything. Most people would have protested. Most people would have shouted. But Marcus stood perfectly still. Richard misread the silence as defeat. "You know what your problem is?" he asked. "You thought nobody would ask questions." He turned toward the growing crowd. "This is exactly why institutions need standards." More phones appeared. Customers whispered among themselves. The attention only seemed to energize Richard. The burning paper curled inward as tiny flakes of ash floated down onto the polished marble floor. Marcus finally spoke. His voice was calm and steady. "Are you finished?" The question caught Richard off guard. For the first time, the manager frowned. "Excuse me." Marcus nodded toward the tray. "Are you finished?" The lobby grew quiet again. Claire felt a chill despite the warm temperature inside the building. There was something unusual about the way he asked it. Not angry, not sarcastic, just patient, as if the outcome had already been decided long before he walked through the front doors. Richard laughed again. "Yes, I'm finished." Marcus looked at the remaining ashes. Sunlight reflected across the marble floor, turning the scattered fragments silver for a moment before they darkened again. He slowly slipped a hand into his jacket pocket. Around him, customers waited. Employees watched. Security stood frozen near the entrance. Nobody understood why the man whose check had just been destroyed seemed completely unbothered. Marcus pulled out his phone and looked down at the screen. His expression never changed. He tapped a single number. Then he lifted the device to his ear. The entire lobby listened as he quietly said 6 words. "The test is over. Come in." The line went silent for less than 3 seconds. Then Marcus lowered the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. Around him, confusion spread through the lobby like ripples across still water. Richard Coleman folded his arms and forced a laugh, but it sounded thinner now. "A test," he said. "Who exactly do you think you were testing?" Marcus did not answer. Instead, he glanced toward the tall windows facing Main Street. Outside, downtown Chicago moved through another ordinary Tuesday morning. Yellow taxis rolled past the intersection. Office workers hurried along the sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet Marcus remained focused on the entrance, as though he knew something everyone else did not. Claire Bennett watched him carefully from behind her desk. She could not explain it, But the man standing in the lobby did not seem embarrassed. Most people would have stormed out by now. Some would have demanded compensation. Others would have threatened lawsuits. Marcus did none of those things. He simply waited. The patience unsettled her. Richard glanced toward the customers still recording with their phones. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced loudly, "I apologize for the disruption. We deal with fraudulent activity regularly. Protecting this bank is our responsibility." A few people nodded. Others looked uncertain. Claire noticed several employees exchanging nervous glances. They had all seen the check before it was destroyed. The paper had looked authentic. The routing numbers appeared legitimate. Even the watermark had been visible beneath the lobby lights. She remembered that detail clearly. Before she could think further, the sound of tires rolling across the curb outside reached the lobby. Several heads turned toward the windows. A black sedan had stopped directly in front of the bank. Then another pulled in behind it. Then a third. Richard frowned. "What is this?" he muttered. The front doors opened automatically as two men in dark suits entered. They were followed by a woman carrying a leather portfolio and another man wearing a security badge clipped to his jacket. None of them spoke immediately. Their eyes moved through the lobby until they found Marcus. The woman approached first. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she said. Her tone was professional and respectful. "We arrived as quickly as possible." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Claire blinked. "Mr. Reed." Richard's smile disappeared. Marcus nodded. "Thank you, Angela." The woman handed him the portfolio. "The documents you requested are inside." Marcus accepted it casually, as though this happened every day. Richard stepped forward. "Excuse me," he interrupted. "Who are you people?" Angela turned toward him. "Angela Brooks, Corporate Compliance Division." Richard's expression tightened. That department operated far above the branch level. He swallowed hard. "Corporate?" Angela nodded. "Yes." Behind her, the second man opened a tablet and reviewed several files. The lobby had become completely silent. Even the customers recording earlier had stopped whispering. Claire noticed the security guard near the entrance standing perfectly still. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Marcus slowly opened the portfolio. Inside were several neatly organized documents. He reviewed them without hurry. Sunlight reflected across the polished pages. Richard shifted his weight. For the first time that morning, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. "What exactly is going on?" he asked. Marcus finally looked at him. His voice remained calm. "For the past 6 months," he said, "I have been visiting branches across the country." Richard stared at him. Marcus continued. "Different clothes, different names, different accounts. One purpose." The room seemed to lean closer. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. Marcus closed the folder gently. "I wanted to see how people were treated when nobody believed they mattered." Outside, another vehicle pulled up to the curb. Inside the lobby, nobody spoke. Richard Coleman suddenly realized this morning was becoming something far bigger than a disputed check. Richard Coleman felt the weight of every eye in the lobby settle on him. The confidence that had carried him through the morning was beginning to crack. He glanced at the customers, then at his employees, searching for some sign that he still controlled the room. Instead, he found uncertainty staring back at him. Marcus Reed remained calm. He stood near the customer service desk with one hand resting on the leather portfolio. Angela Brooks had delivered. The sunlight pouring through the glass facade illuminated tiny particles of ash still scattered across the marble floor. The remains of the destroyed check seemed impossible to ignore. Angela stepped aside as another group entered through the front doors. 2 senior executives in tailored navy suits crossed the lobby with measured steps. Behind them came a gray-haired man carrying a tablet and a woman wearing a corporate identification badge that immediately caught Claire Bennett's attention. She recognized the logo. It belonged to the executive office located nearly 800 miles away in New York City. Those people never visited branch locations without a major reason. The executives stopped in front of Marcus. One after another, they greeted him respectfully. Not a single person questioned his presence. Not a single person treated him as an outsider. Richard felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "This is ridiculous," he said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to himself. "Nobody has explained anything." The gray-haired executive turned toward him. "Actually, Mr. Coleman, everything has been explained." Richard blinked. "Excuse me." The executive adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Reed just informed you that this was a system-wide evaluation. Claire noticed Marcus watching quietly. He was not enjoying Richard's discomfort. He was not smiling. If anything, he seemed disappointed. That expression affected her more than anger would have. Richard straightened his tie. Evaluations are conducted by auditors. Marcus nodded slowly. Sometimes. Richard folded his arms. And who authorized this one? The question lingered in the air. Outside, clouds drifted across the skyline, softening the bright morning sunlight. Inside the lobby, the silence became almost uncomfortable. Then Marcus opened the portfolio and removed a single document. He handed it to Angela. She passed it directly to Richard. The manager looked down. His face drained of color almost immediately. Claire could not see the page clearly from her desk, but she recognized official corporate letterhead. Richard read the first paragraph. Then he read it again. His hands became noticeably less steady. "This cannot be right," he whispered. Marcus finally spoke. "It is right." Richard looked up. "You are telling me that for 6 months you have been visiting branches pretending to be ordinary customers?" Marcus nodded. "Teachers, mechanics, retirees, veterans, small business owners, people who rarely receive special treatment." Claire listened carefully. Marcus continued. "I wanted to understand whether respect depended on appearance, income, or influence." The words settled heavily across the room. Several employees lowered their eyes. Richard stared at the document. "Why?" Marcus glanced toward the windows. A city bus rolled past outside. People hurried along the sidewalk without realizing that an entire branch was standing perfectly still. "Because a bank does not exist for wealthy people," Marcus said quietly. "It exists for trust." Claire felt those words more than she expected. Trust. Not money. Not status. Trust. Richard swallowed hard. "You could have identified yourself." Marcus looked directly at him. "Then I would not have learned the truth." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The distant sound of a printer echoed from a back office. Somewhere near the entrance, a customer slowly lowered his phone. Marcus took a breath and looked around the lobby. His gaze passed over every employee, every customer, every security camera mounted near the ceiling. "The real question," he said calmly, "is not who I am." He paused. The room seemed to hold its breath. "The real question is why so many people watched what happened this morning and believed it was normal." The question hung over the lobby like a weight nobody knew how to lift. Richard Coleman opened his mouth, then closed it again. For years he had been the loudest voice in the room. Now he could not find a single sentence that sounded convincing. Marcus Reed let the silence remain. He did not rush to fill it. He did not enjoy it. He simply allowed everyone to sit with it. Claire Bennett looked around and noticed something she had never seen before. Employees who usually moved with confidence suddenly seemed unsure of where to look. Some stared at their desks. Others focused on computer screens that no longer held their attention. The marble lobby felt different now. Smaller somehow. More exposed. Marcus slowly walked toward the customer service counter. His footsteps echoed softly against the polished floor. He stopped beside Claire and glanced at her name badge. "How long have you worked here, Claire?" Her heart skipped. "Almost 3 months, sir." Marcus nodded. "And when you suggested verifying the account earlier, why did you do that?" Claire hesitated. Every eye seemed to shift toward her. "Because it was the right procedure," she answered honestly. Marcus gave a small nod. "Exactly." He turned toward the rest of the branch. "Procedure exists for a reason. It protects customers. It protects employees. Most importantly, it protects fairness." Richard looked down at the document, still trembling slightly in his hands. "I made a judgment call," he said quietly. Marcus faced him. "You made an assumption." The distinction landed hard. Nobody challenged it. Outside, clouds continued drifting across the city skyline. The bright sunlight softened into a pale silver glow that filtered through the windows. The ash on the marble floor remained untouched. A reminder. A symbol. Something nobody wanted to acknowledge, but nobody could ignore. Angela Brooks stepped forward holding a tablet. "The review team completed the preliminary analysis," she said. Richard looked up sharply. "Already?" Angela nodded. "The findings began accumulating months ago." Several branch employees exchanged confused glances. Marcus folded his hands calmly. Every visit was documented. Every interaction was recorded through standard compliance channels. Richard felt the floor slipping beneath him. "You planned this from the beginning." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "No," his voice remained steady. "I hoped I would be proven wrong." That answer seemed to affect the room more than any accusation could have. Claire noticed a faint sadness in his expression. Not anger, not triumph, disappointment. The kind that comes when someone confirms your worst concern. Marcus walked toward the large windows overlooking Main Street. Traffic flowed steadily below. A delivery truck stopped at a red light. Pedestrians crossed the intersection carrying umbrellas even though the forecast predicted clear skies. Life outside continued normally. Inside the bank, everything had changed. Do you know what I learned during these visits? Marcus asked without turning around. Nobody answered. The people who need respect the most are often the ones least likely to demand it. His reflection appeared faintly in the glass. A retired teacher, a construction worker, a widow managing her savings, a father opening his first account for his daughter. The room remained silent. Most of them walked through these doors trusting us. He finally turned back. Not because of our logo, not because of our buildings, because they believe they will be treated fairly. Richard lowered his eyes. For the first time that morning, he seemed less concerned about his position and more aware of the damage caused by his choices. Marcus noticed it. So did Claire. Yet before anyone could speak again, Angela received a message on her tablet. She glanced at the screen and looked toward Marcus. They are here. Marcus nodded once. The lobby doors opened automatically. A new group entered the branch. The moment Richard saw who had arrived, every remaining trace of confidence vanished from his face. The people entering the lobby were not strangers to Richard Coleman. That was the problem. He recognized every face immediately. The chairman of the board walked in first, followed by 2 members of the executive committee and the regional president responsible for more than 300 branches across the country. These were individuals whose names appeared in annual reports and investor meetings. Richard had spent years hoping to impress them. Now he wished they were anywhere else. The chairman, Harold Whitmore, moved slowly through the lobby, his polished shoes reflecting against the marble floor. His expression revealed nothing. No anger, no sympathy, just quiet observation. Behind him, the executive committee members studied the room carefully. Their eyes paused on the ashes scattered near the customer service counter. Then they looked toward Marcus. Harold stopped a few feet away and extended his hand. Good morning, Marcus. Marcus shook it politely. Thank you for coming. Harold nodded. After reading the reports, I wanted to see this personally. The sentence landed heavily across the room. Richard felt his throat tighten. Claire watched from her desk, trying to process what she was witnessing. Earlier that morning, Marcus had been treated like an inconvenience. Now the highest leadership in the organization was greeting him with obvious respect. Harold turned toward the employees gathered near the counters. Most of you do not know me personally, he said, but I know why this institution exists. His gaze shifted toward the remains of the check. And this is not it. Nobody spoke. Nobody even shifted their weight. The lobby had become completely still. Richard stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, if I may explain, Harold gently raised a hand. The manager stopped immediately. You already explained, Harold said calmly. You explained through your actions. The words carried no hostility. Somehow that made them harder to hear. Marcus remained silent. He was giving Richard every opportunity to reflect on what had happened without interruption. Angela Brooks opened her tablet and displayed several documents. Over the last 6 months, she said, Mr. Reed visited 37 branches in 12 states. Employees exchanged shocked looks. 37 branches. Most locations followed procedures correctly, Angela continued. Many employees demonstrated professionalism and respect regardless of appearance or account size. Claire felt a small sense of relief. Then Angela looked down at the next report. Unfortunately, a handful of branches showed serious concerns. The room seemed to grow colder. Richard knew what was coming. He could see it in her expression. This branch recorded the highest number of customer complaints related to dismissive treatment, procedural shortcuts, and appearance-based assumptions. Several employees lowered their eyes. Richard stared at the floor. Marcus finally spoke. Do you know what surprised me most? His voice remained calm. Nobody answered. It was not what happened to me. He looked around. The room. I expected people to make assumptions. That happens every day. His eyes moved toward the entrance where sunlight now streamed through the glass. What surprised me was how many good people stayed silent when they knew something was wrong. Claire felt those words settle directly into her chest. She remembered speaking up. Briefly, hesitantly, then stopping. Around her, Several employees appeared equally uncomfortable. Harold nodded slowly. Culture is not created by one person, he said. It is created by what everyone accepts. Outside, a gentle breeze moved fallen leaves across the sidewalk. Inside, nobody seemed interested in their phones anymore. Nobody cared about schedules or appointments. The entire branch was listening. Richard finally looked up. For the first time all morning, his voice lacked defensiveness. I thought I was protecting the bank. Marcus studied him quietly. Then he answered. No, the word was soft. Almost gentle. You were protecting an assumption. Silence followed. Long, unavoidable. And in that silence, Richard Coleman began to realize that losing his authority was not the worst consequence of this day. The worst consequence was discovering how far he had drifted from the values he once believed he represented. For several moments, nobody spoke. The energy that had filled the lobby earlier seemed to drain away, leaving behind something quieter and far heavier. The executives stepped back. The employees remained still. Even the customers who had been recording lowered their phones. Outside, the sky had shifted from bright silver to a soft gray blue. Sunlight filtered through drifting clouds and painted long reflections across the marble floor. Marcus Reed walked slowly toward the windows overlooking Main Street. He stood there with his hands resting loosely at his sides. The city moved beyond the glass as if nothing unusual had happened. Cars rolled through green lights. Pedestrians crossed intersections carrying shopping bags and coffee cups. A cyclist disappeared around the corner. Life continued. Inside the bank, time felt different. Claire Bennett watched Marcus's reflection in the glass. For the first time all day, he looked tired. Not physically tired. Something deeper. The kind of exhaustion that comes from seeing the same lesson repeated too many times. Harold Whitmore approached quietly and stood beside him. Neither man spoke at first. The silence felt respectful rather than uncomfortable. Finally, Harold glanced toward the street below. How many? He asked softly. Marcus understood immediately. More than I hoped, he replied. Harold nodded once. Neither seemed surprised. Claire could not hear every word, but she could hear enough. She found herself wondering how many branches Marcus had entered over the past 6 months. How many waiting rooms? How many teller counters? How many conversations? How many moments where people decided someone's worth before learning their name? Richard Coleman remained near the customer service area. The document in his hands had lowered to his side. His shoulders seemed smaller than before. He stared at the scattered ash on the marble floor. A maintenance employee quietly approached with a broom and dustpan. Marcus noticed and gently shook his head. Leave it for now. The employee stopped immediately. Nobody questioned the request. The tiny black fragments remained exactly where they were. Claire understood why. They were evidence, not of a destroyed check, but of a choice. A reminder that some actions could not simply be swept away the moment regret appeared. Outside, a light rain began to fall. Small droplets tapped softly against the glass facade. The sound blended with the distant hum of traffic and created an unexpected calm. Marcus watched the rain for a long moment. Then he spoke without turning around. My father opened his first bank account when he was 39 years old. The room listened. He worked 2 jobs, saved every dollar he could. He wore his best shirt because he believed walking into a bank mattered. His voice remained steady. The employee who helped him never knew how much that moment meant. Claire felt a lump form in her throat. Marcus continued. My father talked about that woman for years. Not because she approved an account, because she treated him with dignity. The rain streaked gently across the glass. No one interrupted. No one moved. That is what people remember, Marcus said. Not interest rates. Not advertisements. How they were treated. Richard closed his eyes briefly. The words seemed to reach him in a way statistics and reports never could. Across the lobby, the executives remained silent. There was no celebration. No victory. No satisfaction. Only reflection. Marcus looked down at the street one final time before turning back toward the room. The rain softened. Sunlight began breaking through the clouds again, creating faint golden reflections across the floor. The ash still rested near the counter. The employees still stood quietly. And in that fragile stillness, something had begun to change, not through authority, not through fear, but through the simple realization that every person who walked through those doors carried a story nobody else could see. The quiet did not last forever. Eventually, Harold Whitmore stepped away from the window and faced the room once more. The rain outside had almost stopped, leaving tiny droplets clinging to the glass like scattered crystals. A pale beam of sunlight pushed through the clouds and stretched across the marble floor. It reached the ashes near the customer service counter and illuminated them for a brief moment. Harold looked toward Angela Brooks. "Please continue." Angela nodded and opened another report on her tablet. "There is one detail the branch employees have not yet been told." Several heads lifted. Richard Coleman looked up slowly. Marcus remained silent. Angela took a breath. The customer account used during today's evaluation was real. A murmur moved through the lobby. The funds were real. The transaction was real. The check was real. Claire felt her pulse quicken. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed changed everything. Angela continued. "The account belongs to Reed Financial Holdings." Richard blinked. He recognized the name instantly. Every executive in the room did. Reed Financial Holdings was one of the largest institutional investors connected to the bank. The company held billions in assets. It financed community projects, small business initiatives, and educational programs across the country. Richard slowly turned toward Marcus. For the first time all morning, he looked at him without assumptions, without labels, without the filter he had relied on for years. He simply looked at the man standing in front of him. Harold folded his hands. "There is something else." The chairman's voice was calm. "Many people assume ownership is simple. One person, one title, one office." He glanced toward Marcus. "Reality is often different." The room became still again. Harold smiled faintly. "The largest individual shareholder of this institution is standing right here." Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Claire stared at Marcus. Several employees looked confused. Others appeared stunned. Richard's expression emptied completely. Marcus did not react. He did not enjoy the moment. He did not stand taller or speak louder. He simply remained himself. Harold continued. 5 years ago, when this bank faced serious financial uncertainty, Reed Financial Holdings provided the capital that stabilized operations and protected thousands of jobs." Angela nodded in agreement. "Including jobs in this branch." The words landed with remarkable force. Richard felt them immediately. The career he had spent years building. The branch he managed. The position he protected so aggressively. All of it existed partly because of decisions Marcus had made years earlier. Yet Marcus had never mentioned it. Never used it. Never carried it like a weapon. Claire found herself staring at the floor for a moment. She thought about the faded jacket Marcus wore when he entered. The worn boots. The quiet manner. How easily people had reduced him to an appearance. How confidently they had been wrong. Marcus finally spoke. "Ownership is not the important part." His voice remained steady. "Responsibility is." The lobby listened carefully. "If you own something, you are responsible for what happens inside it." He glanced around the room. "That includes culture." Richard lowered his eyes. For the first time, there was no argument left. No explanation. No defense. Only understanding. The realization seemed to settle over him slowly, like the rain clouds that had drifted across the city earlier. Marcus looked toward the windows once more. The sky was clearing now. Sunlight reflected from nearby buildings and filled the lobby with warm gold light. The moment felt strangely peaceful, not because the truth had been revealed, but because everyone finally saw it. The man they judged as insignificant had never needed recognition to possess value, and the authority they respected so easily had never been the source of his strength. No one expected what happened next. The executives remained in place. The employees stood frozen. Richard Coleman looked as though he had aged years in a single morning. Every person in the lobby understood that Marcus Reed possessed the authority to make a decision that would alter careers before lunch. Yet Marcus did not immediately speak. Instead, he walked toward the customer service counter where the ashes still rested on the marble floor. The sunlight streaming through the windows had turned them into tiny black specks surrounded by gold reflections. He crouched slightly and studied them for a moment. Then he stood again. "Do you know what those ashes represent?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered. Marcus looked toward Richard. "Most people would say they represent a destroyed check." Richard swallowed hard. Marcus shook his head. "They do not." The room remained silent. "They represent a moment when someone made a decision about another human being without knowing anything about them." Claire Bennett felt the truth of those words immediately. Marcus turned toward the employees gathered behind the counters. The check could be replaced. He glanced down at the floor. The money was never the issue. His eyes lifted again. Respect is harder to restore. Richard lowered his head. For the first time all morning, he appeared less worried about consequences and more aware of what had actually happened. Harold Whitmore watched quietly from across the lobby. The executives exchanged brief glances, but did not interrupt. They seemed content to let Marcus lead the moment. Outside, the rain had fully passed. Patches of blue sky appeared between the clouds. Sunlight brightened the windows and filled the branch with a warm glow that softened the tension in the room. Marcus slowly approached Richard. The manager looked up. His expression carried none of the confidence that had defined him earlier. "Mr. Reed," he began quietly. "I was wrong." The admission hung in the air. Nobody moved. "I judged you before I knew you." Richard's voice wavered slightly. "I thought I was protecting standards. I was protecting my own assumptions." Marcus listened without interruption. Richard took a slow breath. "I cannot undo what happened." "No," Marcus replied gently. "You cannot." Another silence followed. Yet this one felt different. Less sharp. Less defensive. Richard nodded slowly. "Then I will accept whatever decision comes next." Several employees looked down. Claire felt her chest tighten. She knew what everyone expected. Termination. Public removal. A final lesson delivered through punishment. Marcus glanced toward the windows. For a long moment, he seemed lost in thought. Then he looked back at Richard. "If this were only about me," he said, "the decision would be easy." Richard frowned slightly. Marcus continued. "But leadership is not about proving power." The words settled over the room. "It is about creating change." Harold Whitmore smiled faintly. Claire noticed it immediately. Marcus turned toward Angela Brooks. "How many customer service improvement proposals has this branch submitted during the last year?" Angela checked her tablet. "None." Marcus nodded. Then he looked back at Richard. "That changes today." Confusion spread through the room. Richard blinked. "Sir." Marcus folded his hands calmly. "You are going to spend the next 6 months leading a customer respect initiative across this region." The employees stared. Richard looked stunned. "You still trust me with that responsibility?" Marcus held his gaze. "Trust is not given because someone is perfect." The sunlight reflected across the marble floor. Trust is earned when someone chooses to grow after seeing the truth. Richard stood speechless. Around him, the atmosphere in the branch shifted again. Not toward celebration. Toward something quieter. Relief. Understanding. Hope. For the first time that day, the lesson was no longer about humiliation. It was about what came after it. 6 weeks later, the branch looked different. Not because the marble floors had changed or because new signs decorated the walls. The difference lived in smaller things. Customers were greeted before they reached the counter. Employees stepped out from behind their desks to help elderly visitors complete paperwork. New account holders received patient explanations instead of rushed instructions. The atmosphere felt warmer, more human. On a crisp autumn morning, Claire Bennett arrived early and paused near the entrance. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, painting long golden rectangles across the floor. Near the customer service area stood a framed plaque that had not been there before. It contained only 6 words. "Every customer deserves respect." No signature, no title, no corporate branding. Just the message. Claire smiled softly. She knew exactly who had approved it. Across the lobby, Richard Coleman was speaking with an elderly couple opening their first joint savings account. There was no impatience in his voice. No assumption. No judgment. He listened carefully, answered every question, and walked them through each form personally. When the couple left, they thanked him twice. Richard watched them go with a thoughtful expression. The transformation had not happened overnight. Growth never did. Yet it was real. Angela Brooks had reported measurable improvements across the entire region. Customer satisfaction scores had risen. Employee training programs had expanded. More importantly, people had begun paying attention to moments that once would have been ignored. The small moments. The human moments. Claire glanced toward the entrance as the doors slid open. A man stepped inside wearing a simple brown jacket and worn boots. For a brief second, her heart skipped. The resemblance was almost perfect. Then she laughed quietly when she realized it was someone else entirely. Still, the moment reminded her of that morning. The morning everything changed. Outside, leaves drifted across the sidewalk in the cool breeze. Inside, the bank hummed with ordinary life. A young father helped his daughter place coins into a savings account. A retired teacher discussed investment options with a financial advisor. A construction worker deposited a paycheck before heading to his next job site. Each person carried a story. Each person mattered. Near noon, a black sedan rolled slowly past the building. Claire happened to glance through the window at exactly the right moment. Sitting in the back seat was Marcus Reed. He was not looking at the plaque. He was not checking for recognition. Instead, he watched a teller helping an elderly customer reach a signature line on a form. The interaction lasted only seconds. Yet Marcus smiled. A small smile. Quiet. Genuine. Then the sedan continued down the street and disappeared into the flow of downtown traffic. Claire stood near the window for a moment longer. The sunlight warmed the glass beneath her fingertips. Behind her, conversations continued. Phones rang softly. Keyboards clicked. Life moved forward. She looked once more at the plaque near the counter. Every customer deserves respect. The words seemed simple now, almost obvious. Yet she knew how difficult some lessons could be, especially the ones hidden in plain sight. Outside, the wind carried a few golden leaves across the pavement. Inside, no one noticed. And perhaps that was the most beautiful part. The lesson no longer needed an audience. It had become part of the culture, part of the building, part of the people. The last trace of sunlight reflected across the marble floor where ashes had once rested, and in the quiet that followed, the bank felt exactly as it should have all along.